A great application of integration, especially area between two curves, is this idea of consumer and producer surplus, which comes from the idea of looking at the supply, the demand, and the all-important equilibrium between the two. Let's look at what this looks like on a graph. Now, if we graph the number of things that are produced compared to the price, and we think about the consumer's viewpoint, the buyer, the consumer will pay a high price if only a few things are produced. And the consumer will pay a lower price if many things are produced. This is the demand curve by the consumer. Contrast that with how many things are going to be produced added to the supply by the supplier. Well, if the price is low, they're only going to produce a few things. And if the price is high, they'll produce more things. This is the supply curve driven by the supplier. What's important is where these two intersect, we call that the equilibrium point. At some XE number of things produced, and at some PE price, where both the supply curve and the demand curve are in perfect balance or equilibrium. What's interesting to note is this space above the equilibrium price, below the demand curve, is the amount the consumer was willing to pay for it. The consumer was willing to pay more than this price, but they did not have to. So this shaded area in gray is actually the savings to the consumer because they didn't have to pay that higher price. They paid that lower equilibrium price. We call that the consumer's surplus. What's interesting also, though, is this bottom area is above the supply curve, which means this represents the producer is selling things at more than that minimum price they were willing to sell for. That's actually an additional profit to the producer. We call this the producer's surplus. And so if we look at these things, we've got these two things, consumer and producer surplus. The consumer's surplus is the savings of the customers who would have paid more than the equilibrium price. So that's the gray area. So I'll box this in gray to emphasize that's the gray area. So that equation then, that's really just the area between the blue curve and the red equilibrium price. In other words, the consumer surplus is equal to the integral that goes from the 0 to the equilibrium point of that demand curve minus the equilibrium price, the area between the two curves, dx. That's how we're going to calculate consumer surplus. And similarly, the producer's surplus that's the extra profit from selling for more than they were willing to sell. That is the orange area, the producer's surplus. And that is the area between the red line and the green line. So it is the integral from 0 to the x equilibrium point. This time, though, we're going to go from the red line, the PE, and we will subtract that supply curve. And so this integral becomes our producer's surplus. We now have formulas for consumer and producer surplus. Our next video is going to look at how we can actually calculate these two areas.